Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome. The British Foreign Ministry announced that British, American and Libyan delegates have met in London to discuss destroying Libya's weapons of mass destruction. The British ministry said that this meeting is part of ongoing negotiations about bilateral relations. British press said that American delegates headed by Assistant Secretary of State William Burns is visiting London to discuss getting rid of Libya's weapons. Washington announced that it may lift some of the sanctions imposed on Libya by allowing Americans to visit Libya and exchange limited diplomatic representation. The U.S. Defense Department confirmed that it has appointed military lawyers to defend 2 Guantanamo detainees who are suspected of being involved in terrorist activities. The State Department released a videotape showing the daily lives of prisoners, which appeared to be semi-normal. In the tape, the detainees appear to be exercising. Despite these developments at the Guantanamo Detention Center, security restrictions are still tight. The detainees are still under strict surveillance enforced by American soldiers. Hundreds of Iraqis demonstrate in Al Khaldiya area in Baghdad, demanding the U.S. forces release Iraqi detainees, especially the ones who were not involved in any act of aggression against the coalition forces. The demonstration occurred in front of an American military base, where security was stepped up in fear of an attack on the base. Demonstrators also demanded the coalition authority to stop the random search campaigns, which the Iraqis' homes are being subjected to every day. The spokesman for the Chechen leader Aslan Maskhadov rebutted direct accusations by the Russian President Vladimir Putin, blaming him for the explosion in Moscow. Meanwhile, the Russian Deputy Minister of Interior reported that the initial death toll due to the suicide bombing has reached at least 59, with 120 others wounded.
كانت الساعة تشير إلى 8:30 صباحا بتوقيت موسكو.
It was 8:30 a.m. Moscow local time when a massive explosion shook the second carriage of an underground train which linked the 2 stations of Pavarotskia and Otovozaskia. The only emergency exit was through the Pavarotskia gate, where dozens of bodies were evacuated. It is also where they pulled out the injured and wounded, transporting them to nearby hospitals. Ambulances waited in an area close to the exit gate, which is normally crowded with all types of transportation vehicles, especially during the morning rush hour. The Russian police evacuated other nearby metro stations in fear of another operation.
There are many people injured, but I don't know how many are dead. An explosion happened in the second carriage. The train operator said he saw body parts in there.
The firemen were able to put out the fire which blazed into the metro tunnel. They brought containers of oxygen to the station to avoid suffocation from the heavy smoke that was coming from the explosion site.
People were getting ready to get off when the explosion happened.
الاحتمالات الأولى حسب تقارير جهاز الأمن الفيدرالي الروسي ترجح فرضية.
Initial reports from the Russian Federal Security Agency believe that this was a terrorist suicide attack and that an explosive container was detonated inside the metro. Suicide operations in Moscow and other parts of Russia were usually carried out by Chechen separatists fighting Russian forces to establish an independent Islamic state in the Kafkaz area. Some analysts want to rush the signing of an agreement with the Chechens because the operation occurred weeks before the presidential elections scheduled for March 14th. The Russian President Vladimir Putin may easily be elected for another term.
In occupied Iraq, sources close to Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Sistani said that the news about His Eminence's assassination attempt was not accurate. This clarification came during a telephone call with Sayyid Muhammad Rida Sistani, the Ayatollah's son. Our correspondent in the holy city of Najaf meanwhile reported that an individual was arrested after attempting to enter al-Sistani's office for a still unclear purpose. The representative of Sayyid Sistani in the holy city of Karbala, Abdul Mahdi al-Karbala'i, said that the arrest of one individual does not mean that there was an assassination attempt. For his part, Iraqi governing council member Muwaffaq al-Rubai visited Sayyid Sistani and assured that His Eminence is safe and in good health. UN experts headed for Iraq on Friday to examine the possibility of holding elections for a transitional assembly. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan ordered the mission after the US-led occupation failed to broker a compromise deal over its right timetable for handing self-rule to a transitional assembly selected by provincial caucuses. The team is expected to stay for about 10 days. Since the former head of the Iraq survey group, David Kay, resigned 2 weeks ago, his statements that Saddam Hussein purported weapons of mass destruction did not exist at the time of the US-led invasion of the country have sparked an intense debate over the pre-war intelligence that the Bush administration used to justify the war.
Nearly 1 year after the US-led invasion of Iraq began, no weapons of mass destruction were found, knowing that these weapons were the main reason used by Washington to justify the war. Intelligence given prior to the war were, according to the so-called White House Eagles, precise. But as the failure in finding any of these alleged WMDs is mounting, suspicions reign over the information provided by George Tenet's CIA and which some say are manipulated intelligence. In his first public defense of pre-war intelligence, CIA Director George Tenet struck a delicate balance Thursday, refusing to take the heat as scapegoat amid doubts over alleged Iraqi banned weapons, while also moving to try to protect President George W. Bush.
Let me be clear. Analysts differed on several important aspects of these programs, and those debates were spelled out in the estimate. They never said there was an imminent threat.
Tenet condemned himself when he acknowledged some gaps on Iraq in the run-up to the war, particularly involving human assets or spies on the ground. He also acknowledged that some intelligence found to have been false had not been discarded.
I can tell you with certainty that the President of the United States gets his intelligence from one person and one community, me. And he has told me firmly and directly that he's wanted it straight and he's wanted it honest and he's never wanted the facts shaded. And that's what we do every day. The rest of it, I don't know.
U.S. President George W. Bush spoke shortly after Tenet was defending his agency's work. After he was sure that Iraq possesses banned weapons, claiming to be aware of their locations, Bush retreated to say that the White House Eagles had not found banned weapons, which he thought were in Iraq.
As the Chief Weapons Inspector said, we have not yet found the stockpiles of weapons that we thought were there.
Former Chief U.S. Arms Inspector in Iraq David Kay said last week that U.S. pre-war intelligence on Iraqi weapons was almost all wrong. Kay refuted claims that the size of Iraq was hampering the Iraq Survey Group's ability to find any weapons of mass destruction. Speaking to reporters in Washington just hours after Tenet vigorously defended pre-war intelligence on the situation in Iraq, Kay said it was insulting to the weapons inspectors to believe that they were seeking the weapons or materials by just searching the country.
What we did, and I think what anyone would have done in that situation, is say, look, if there were large stockpiles, they had to be produced by people, they had to be produced in facilities, and they would have left some indelible signs. Where are those people? Where are those facilities? Where are the documents, the importation, and the other records of such large production? Those have not been found.
Intelligence were at the heart of Bush's case for going to war. Tenet said in a Washington speech that the intelligence community was neither completely right nor completely wrong about Iraq. Thousands lost their lives and their families because of what has been proved to be mere estimations, and yet none of the so-called Eagles want to stand responsible.
British government still faces searching questions over the information used to justify the war in Iraq. Although the Hutton report last week cleared Prime Minister Tony Blair and his colleagues of hyping up a dossier on Iraq weapons, Defence Minister Jeff Hoon was fielding questions on Thursday about what he knew and what he told Blair before the war.
A key dossier in September 2002 that argued the UK government's case for war claimed that Iraq could deploy its weapons of mass destruction in 45 minutes. A judicial inquiry later heard that the claim referred only to battlefield weapons, not long-range missiles. Prime Minister Tony Blair said on Wednesday that when he urged lawmakers to vote for military action in March 2003, he was unaware the claim related only to battlefield weapons. Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon has already publicly stated that he knew what the claim referred to at the time. The Defence Select Committee hearing wants to know why the Defence Secretary knew, while on the eve of war, the Prime Minister apparently did not.
I obviously briefed the Prime Minister on a regular basis, and had this had been a significant issue in terms of the decision to take the country to war, then I'm sure that this issue would have arisen in conversation between us. But as I emphasised, it was not a significant issue. The Prime Minister did not mention the so-called 45-minute claim in his speech to Parliament immediately before that decision was taken by the House of Commons. So all I'm emphasising to you is that I'm sure, had this have been a big issue for this committee, for members of Parliament and indeed for the public, then this matter would have arisen. Since it was not a big issue at the time, except that it has become one since, but since it was not a big issue at the time, this was not a matter that we discussed.
Opposition leader Michael Howard says the Prime Minister must have known about Iraq's capabilities, or should have done.
The Prime Minister is saying that he took Britain to war, that he committed British troops to battle, without bothering to ask the simple question about whether the biological and chemical weapons which he thought Iraq had could only be used on the battlefield in Iraq, or could be put on the end of a missile and fired at British troops in Cyprus. I can't imagine anything more serious than that.
One man who lost his son in Iraq says it's clear that the British people were misled.
The deceit just beggars belief. My son was in the middle of a PTI training course, and they took him off it, gave him an anthrax injection and sent him to Iraq. And as a parent, I was deceived. I thought that there was this imminent threat. And I think Iraq had had its teeth pulled long ago, after the first Gulf War, and with the subsequent sanctions, that they were not a threat to this country at all.
He says the true reasoning behind the war is obvious.
America now has secured a pipeline running out of Iraq through Turkey, guarded by the American troops. That's the bottom line. My son has died for America's oil supplies.
The Blair administration may have won its battle with the BBC over allegations that it deliberately sexed up the dossier on Iraq's weapons, being cleared by the Hutton report last week, but many Britons are finding it increasingly difficult to square the conclusions of the inquiry with what was submitted to it and what has been said since. Rick Hodgson, Dubai Television.
Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced that the unilateral steps that must be taken are hurting him more than any other citizen in Israel. Sharon concluded that he must take these steps so that the state of Israel can have the opportunity to develop and provide the maximum amount of security to the country and its citizens, confirming that he is responsible for this subject matter. Our reporter Eli Nissan provides more details about the Prime Minister's plan. The Prime Minister is determined to take unnatural steps to separate from the Palestinian side. This decision was an extension of